Today I'd like to talk about Aboriginal rights and economic uncertainty. I don't know how many of you people sort of follow sometimes in the media when they talk about Aboriginal title and Aboriginal rights, that they also talk about economic uncertainty and whether or not you really ever think about what is really meant by economic uncertainty. Because I think it's very critical to understand what is meant by economic uncertainty and what that actually really means in terms of you as Indigenous people and you as people living in Indigenous territories, especially here in British Columbia, in terms of the kinds of decisions and the kind of power, economic power, that you have because of that economic uncertainty. And I think it's really clear when you look, just more recently, like on October 12th, when the Premier of the province, Christy Clark, was announcing that she wanted to open up 8 new mines by 2015, like 4 years from now. And that as a part of that jobs plan that she was talking about, she also needed to get 10 agreements with some Indian bands with regard to those mines. That really raises the issue of economic uncertainty and what it means for Indigenous people. Because Indigenous people, in that sense, in terms of those 10 agreements, actually are part of the strategy for the province's economic plans with regard to employment of their people. And here's a picture of a demonstration that we had in Vancouver when the Canadian Aboriginal Mining Association was being hosted. They were having a meeting at the Pan Pacific. A number of Indigenous people who were concerned about mining in their area got together and had a demonstration, just basically to show the mining company what it means in relationship to economic uncertainty. So that's what I mean, that there is this issue of economic uncertainty. We'll get back to it in the constitutional sense, in the legal sense. But I wanted to start off with the values, what we're talking about in terms of, I guess, Indigenous-based values and Eurocentric type values. Because when I'm talking about economics, I'm not talking about microeconomics like a fish farm, or talking about microeconomics like just a mine in itself and specifically. I'm talking about macroeconomics. Aboriginal title and Aboriginal rights is a macroeconomic interest. It goes to the very source and ownership of the underlying title of the whole territory of Indigenous people. It's not restricted by the Mining Act or the Forestry Act or those microeconomic type decisions. It goes to the very source of underlying ownership of everything in the territory. And originally Indigenous people, in their terms of values, valued the animals, the land, the water, and the air on an equal circle. And that's what we show here as a circle. It's a circular-based value of the land and how decisions were made. This is how Indian people managed North America before the first white people came here. That's when they arrived back 500 years ago, and this continent was abundant with resources, fish. I remember one time when I was a kid watching a National Film Board film, and they said, as long as there's so much cod, we'll never run out of cod. Now I hear that we've run out of cod, and that's because there's a different motivation in terms of what cod is. Cod, to the fishermen in that case and to the government, was really governed for profit. It wasn't governed in terms of the circular kind of concept, because on this side I sort of have what I call the Eurocentric concept of economics, where the land is looked at as a resource, where you put the land, the resource into production, and you feed the stuff into a consumer market, you sell it, you produce garbage and profit. And that's generally how the world has been operating, since the beginning of that Eurocentric concept of economy that has been running in this North America for the last few hundred years. And people are having serious questions about that economy, especially when the people were talking about Occupy Wall Street, because they were concerned about that hierarchical system of economics, because they realized that when you do that kind of economics, especially in the petroleum industry, and you're taking the soil and you're converting it into gas through your vehicle, you're creating global warming. They're starting to realize the concept of the circle, that when you do change the land a bit and convert it, you do wind up producing a kind of environment that's going to basically kill our children in the future, because they're going to run out of air. Anyways, just leave it at that. Now I'd like to just talk about the constitutional concept of economics, because I think one of the things is that Canadians have to get back to some basics, and we're going to have to go back to the Constitution, because the Constitution itself has been creating a kind of economy that we have been stuck in. And this right here represents the kind of economy that the English created in Canada way back in 1867. And under the British North America Act, which was the Canadian Constitution from 1867 to 1982. And in that kind of concept, there was only two bodies that could make law in relationship to our territorial lands, and that was the federal and the provincial government. Decisions with regard to our land could either be made in Victoria or in Ottawa, but it could never be made here. And that's why Indigenous people were impoverished, and that's why Indigenous people continue to be impoverished, is because this is the kind of economic framework that has been operating and running the economy of this country. And Indigenous people have been struggling, like one of the leaders were saying from a house, against that. And that's the kind of a system that's operating under the Ministry of Mines right now, because this right here sort of sets out the four cornerstones of the Ministry of Mines. And they sort of treat First Nations just as local communities, but they themselves claim access to land as being an exclusive provincial aspect of their jurisdiction in terms of mines, and which is not true, because the very land that we're talking about is Aboriginal title land. So this has to be challenged by Indigenous people. And Indigenous people challenged that kind of concept in 1980, when the Indians from BC rented a train that went from Vancouver to Ottawa on the Constitution Express, where they challenged the Trudeau and Chrétien, the authors of this 1969 white paper policy, challenged them, and resulted in Section 35 being added to the Constitution. And that's what the Constitution really looks like right now, is there isn't just two orders of government like it was before. There's actually three orders of government. And you need to think about that. The three orders are obviously the federal and provincial government, but also Aboriginal title and rights creates a third order of government. And that's what the chiefs were talking about, the leaders were talking about before, is that Indigenous people are part of that decision-making process. That's what Christy Clark is talking about when she says she needs 10 extra agreements. She's talking about that third piece there. That third piece has not been defined, because we need to define it as Indigenous people from the community up. And the Canadians have to really think about that, because the federal and provincial government has been dominated by big government, big business, and it's a top-down type government. It's not a bottom-up type government, and you know that. So come you're concerned about the mines and what's going to happen, what are the guys going to decide in Victoria vis-a-vis mines, or what are they going to decide on fisheries in DFO in Ottawa, instead of the issues from the local people from the bottom up. That red part there is a bottom-up type government. It's from the local people and the local communities throughout the British Columbia. It's the only constitutionally recognized capacity of anybody from the bottom up to govern from a different perspective and challenge the old order of government. Because the old order of government is an economy based on Section 91-92 economy. A new economy needs to be created that also recognizes that Indigenous people have a right to say and participate in economics, and we want to start from a bottom-up economy as opposed to a top-down type economy. But that's not really what's happening, because under the Federal Comprehensive Land Claims Policy, under the British Columbia Treaty process, what they want to do is extinguish our title. What they want to do is reduce it and take it back out. And I really appreciate it when I hear leaders from the community level saying that they're not going to participate in that process, because that says that we want to rebuild that. We don't want to lose it. You know, we want to build it strong, because Aboriginal title are things that we can do as Indigenous people that we don't need to ask permission from Victoria, or we don't need to ask permission from Ottawa. It's like hunting. It's like fishing. It's like Aboriginal title, because Aboriginal title is one of the things that the Supreme Court of Canada recognized in the Dalgamuk case in 1997 was an Aboriginal right. That's something that we control from the bottom up. It's something that involves all of these mines, obviously. So when we're being put in pressure by the province to deal with making decisions on mines, let us not just look at them in terms of just jobs. Let's look at them in terms of what kind of economy do we want for the future? What does this mean in terms of the trees? What does this mean in terms of the fish? What does this mean in terms of the water? What does this mean in terms of the air? Those are big responsibilities that Indigenous people have to put on their agenda, and not just jobs, because they would love you just to talk about jobs. You know, because then you just sort of fit in like everybody else. You sort of become part of the Eurocentric hierarchical process of economy, instead of trying to force the economy to change its set of values to include the kind of vision that Indigenous people, you know, have been promoting through their songs and their dances. So anyways, I think one of the things people need to say is like Aboriginal title, and the media recognizes, this is from the Vancouver Sun, it says Aboriginal title certainty is still a question. You know, that sort of rings back very clear that the whole economy realizes this. And Indigenous people, especially young unemployed Native people, reading this section should say, well, what are we going to do about this? Especially in view of the fact that I'm one of the 60% in my community that is unemployed. And I'm being talked about in the business section of Vancouver Sun. What are my leaders doing at the community level based on up to be able to get heard? You know, this whole question about political and economic uncertainty has to be addressed by Indigenous people. Because one of the things that very clearly you need to realize, that in Dalgamuk, the reason Aboriginal title was recognized was because none of the property created by the province ever extinguished Aboriginal title, because the Indian people know that throughout British Columbia there's some form of proprietary interest, provincial proprietary interest in every corner, you know, but none of it's extinguished it, you know. Yeah, Aboriginal title. So Aboriginal title is something grown. And I just want to say here that one of the issues is like in Kamloops, for instance, they signed an agreement with the Kamloops Indian Band where they agreed to share in economic rent. And that's something that people have to realize, is those are questions that Indigenous people need to understand and start discussing. One of the things I just want to leave with, and I know I just got a few seconds here, is that Indigenous people have to look at insurance, because it has to do with your proprietary interest as Indigenous people. And you have to look at British Columbia and Canada's credit ratings, because that'll provide you with the impetus to move the government. And those are interests that are developing and growing interests, and we can talk about those in other sessions. But there is a real power that you people have, and you have to build on it from the bottom up. Anyways, thank you very much. Bye.